Welcome back to the second part of session 5 of the Eugene Review Panel. This is going to be an hour-long section with 3 presenters that have all been selected by the panel on the previous over the previous 2 sessions, and I am going to turn it over to Alex, our lead moderator, to lead this section.
Hi, everybody. So as Lynn said, we have 3 presenters today that you all have chosen. One of them is Ethan Stuckmeyer, who's been with us before. And so let's start with the other 2 presenters, who are John Belcher and Danielle Aragoni. I will read their bios. They will present for 10 minutes. Presenters, I will give you a warning when you've hit that 10-minute mark. Just ask you to wrap it up as soon as you can. And then we will have plenty of time for questions after all of them have gone. So let's start with John Belcher. John Belcher has been involved in community activism in Eugene for over 30 years. He's been a board member and chair of the Jefferson Westside Neighbors, Amazon Neighbors, and River Road Community Organization. He has also served as Eugene Planning Commissioner, Police Commissioner, Human Rights Commissioner, as well as several other Eugene committees, such as the Charter Review Committee, Citizen Involvement Committee, District 4J School Closure Committee, and others. He is currently a representative to and co-chair of the Neighborhood Leaders Council's Land Use Committee, a director of Better Eugene Springfield Transportation, and on the Eugene City Club Program Committee. He is also co-chair of the River Road Community Organization and co-chair of the Community Advisory Committee for the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Planning Committee, which is currently working with city and county staff to develop the draft neighborhood plan. John has lived in Eugene for over 40 years and is retired from the U.S. Forest Service. So thank you, John, for being with us, and I will let you know when your 10 minutes are up.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm really excited to see what you guys are going to come up with. I'm going to do 2 things here. First of all, talk about the role of neighborhood associations in land use planning, and then talk a little bit about how I view your tasks for middle housing. So getting involved with land use in Oregon is challenging, to say the least, and I think you'll see that as you learn more if you haven't already. This all began with Senate Bill 100 back in 1973, 47 years ago, and since then the rules have been set at different levels. First of all, there's the state level. For example, the legislature will pass a bill such as House Bill 2001. Then the Department of Land Conservation and Development will take that and create various statutes that actually implement that, and that's what they're doing right now, hopefully by the end of December, and pass that on to you. Cities and counties then take that information and they develop land use code, such as Eugene's land use code, chapter 9. As you can see, it's not small, and this is the size of it in 1974. I don't know how big it is now, but at any rate, cities and counties create their own code. And then the third way that this information the rules get set is through appeals. So there are local appeals. Any land use decision that's made has an appeal process at the local level, either with a hearings official, the planning commission itself, the director of the planning department, or even sometimes the city council. So each time they make a decision, that adds to the body of rules land use is operating under. There's an additional appeal process at the state level. There's actually a state court called the Land Use Board of Appeals, where if someone, either the developer or the neighbors or some other individual are not happy with that decision at the local level, they can appeal to the state level, to the Land Use Board of Appeals. They hear the case, they make a decision. That again adds to the body of rules that land use planning follows. And if people aren't happy with that decision, they can appeal to the appeals court, the state Supreme Court, and even the federal Supreme Court, and then even greater body of decisions are added that affect any land use decision in the future. So What we have now is 47 years of state statutes and administrative rules, local code, and court decisions that make an extraordinarily complex web of land use rules. It's hard for anyone besides professional planners and land use attorneys to figure out how to work within that system. But the state did make as their very first goal for land use in their 19 goals is citizen involvement. Goal 1 calls for the opportunity for citizens to be involved in all phases of the planning process, and it requires each city and county to have a citizen involvement program that addresses opportunities for public involvement, effective two-way communication, and making technical information understandable to the public. So for these reasons and others, the city of Eugene established 23 neighborhood associations covering almost every area inside the urban growth boundary of Eugene, and gives them several responsibilities, which include advise the city council and planning commission on matters affecting growth and development of the neighborhood, and to develop neighborhood proposals with respect to land use and zoning, to address all matters which affect the neighborhood and educate the citizens of the neighborhood on matters of common concern, and then preserve and develop the neighborhood and achieve the objectives of this and other neighborhood associations. So we're given that responsibility and role. And there's two primary ways we do that as neighborhood associations. We can involve ourselves during the development of plans and new land use code through participation via committees and providing testimony during public hearings when new land use code and plans are developed, as it will be in this case. The city specifically involves affected neighborhoods in developing neighborhood plans. There's some 20 or so, or 30 or so, I'm not sure how many, for their areas within the city. Currently, I and others in the River Road and Santa Clara area are involved in developing such a process with the city and county. The second way we can get involved is through initiating and or participating in the land use process, the appeal process specifically. It's challenging for volunteers such as us to research all those city and state statutes and legal decisions and try to figure out how we can make our case for a project that we think is problematic for the neighborhood. Especially since on the other side, typically the developer has hired land use lawyers, expert testimony, et cetera, to make their side of the case. I think we don't even have the education that you were getting in this process, so it is challenging. Additionally, I think there's a problem with how these land use decisions are made. It's a quasi-judicial process, and it is what you may have heard the term zero-sum game. There's a winner and a loser, but there's no real opportunity for compromise. Each side makes their argument to whatever the deciding body is, and the deciding body decides, well, this side wins or that side wins, maybe with some conditions that try to mitigate it, but there's no opportunity for give and take. So as a result, you get what happens in our community where land use decisions are made and they really don't meet the needs of the developer. Well, they often don't meet the needs of the developer and or the neighborhood. So that's the land use process and the neighborhood's role in involving themselves in it. I just want to make an argument to you that as you look at your recommendations to the city as to how House Bill 2001 should be implemented, I want to make the point that there's need for more than just land use code to implement middle housing. If you look at the website on missing middle housing, Daniel Perlek, who started out this idea, stated that missing middle housing is a range of housing scale buildings with multiple units compatible in scale and form with detached single family houses located in walkable neighborhoods. The land use code that you're developing will help you do that, and that's important. Right now, our current land use code makes it very difficult to build anything other than single family homes or large multifamily apartment complexes, and we need middle housing. We've had it in the past, it's time to bring it back. But there's another issue around the word middle, and that is missing middle housing also relates to affordability or attainability level. These housing types are intended to deliver attainable choices in middle housing families and giving more of a middle income market. The attempt is to achieve affordable housing price points for rental and for sale without subsidies. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. First of all, building new housing is expensive, both because of labor and materials. And additionally, in Eugene, it's even more expensive because we have a very small supply of land that hasn't already been developed. So that land is very expensive, which adds to the cost of housing. And it's even more expensive to build infill in an already developed lot. The worst case scenario is when a developer decides to take an already developed lot with an older affordable house, either affordable in rent or in purchase, tears that house down and builds new middle housing that is market rate housing and therefore more expensive. It seems to me we're actually losing ground in that respect. So once again, just writing code will make it possible to build this kind of housing, but will it be affordable? Not unless we look at other ways to make that housing affordable. So I encourage you to ask for information about incentives the city can provide to encourage housing affordability in these new housing types, and that you recommend that they actually do so. So here's some examples of what could be done. The city collects system development charges to pay for the cost of new infrastructure. Since middle housing is most likely to be infill, it doesn't make sense to charge the same price for an 800 square foot accessory dwelling unit or other middle housing than you charge for a 3,000 square foot house. That's one. Number two, expedite the approval process for middle housing. Time is money for developers. For one thing, the city could develop approved housing plans so that if a developer decides to use one of those plans, they don't have to go through as onerous a planning process. Number three, explore creative financing structures such as community land trust. In community land trust, the land itself is owned by a nonprofit organization, and the house is owned by the folks who buy it, and therefore the housing cost goes down because you're not having to charge for the land. Are there other financial subsidies that might be brought to bear, such as MUPTI or using the construction excise tax that the city is allowed to collect, which is now going for low-income housing, capital H affordable housing, which is provided by housing agencies such as St. Vincent de Paul and Cornerstone, but it could be used to actually help people buy their first starter homes. The primary way of achieving capital in our country is in housing, buying a house. When you rent a house, you can't do that. So hopefully you guys can help find ways that some of this middle housing can actually be viable. Finally,
so if you could wrap
one more thing.
Thank you.
Using inclusionary zoning to require some portion of larger developments be affordable. So thanks for all that, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, John. All right, so our next presenter is Danielle Aragoni. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies if not. Danielle is Director of Livable Communities at AARP, where she works to support AARP's 53 state offices, including DC, USVI, and Puerto Rico, and the nearly 500 localities and several states enrolled in the AARP network of age-friendly states and communities, to create great places for all people of all ages. Danielle leads the team responsible for supporting age-friendly network members, developing free practitioner-focused publications on topics ranging from ADUs to placemaking to rural livability, and delivering direct technical assistance to nearly 100 communities each year. Her team also disseminates a free weekly newsletter on livable communities-related issues, reaching more than 100,000 local leaders around the country. Danielle is an urban planner by education and has more than 20 years of professional experience contributing to more sustainable and resilient federal, state, and local policy, including prior leadership positions at US EPA and HUD. She also serves as a board member for the League of American Bicyclists. Danielle holds a master's degree in regional planning from Cornell University and a bachelor's degree from planning from the University of Oregon. I'll turn it over to you, Danielle.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm really happy to be here. As you just heard, I'm a graduate of U of O in the planning department. So this whole experience brings joy to my heart. So glad to have a role in this, even from afar. So I'm going to go quickly through this so we get to everything. What really the sort of catalyst for AARP to be involved in this type of work is really this huge demographic shift that is underway, that we in which we are very shortly in the year 2034 going to be a country comprised more of people over 65 than under 18 for the first time ever. And in many communities, probably parts of Oregon, certainly in many states around the country, that's happening even faster, where we're seeing the share of older adults as a part of the larger population grow and really overtake even the degree to which we are communities of younger people. So by 2030, we'll be, 1 in 5 people will be over 65. That's really not that far away. And when we think about whether our communities are ready for that demographic shift, I think in our belief system, it's easy to conclude that they're not. When you look at things like housing, where there's a huge mismatch between who we are as a country in terms of our demographics, with more than half of our households being comprised of 1 or 2 people, and yet 85% of our housing stock is 2, 3, 4 or more bedrooms. We all are aware, I think, of the huge affordability crisis that's underway, particularly for older renters, and the fact that we have a very minimally satisfactory level of universally designed homes. Those same, I think, differences and gaps certainly carry forward into transportation as well as parks. I won't emphasize those for the purposes of today, but they all increase, all the built environment dynamics that we see at work increase to a sense of contribute to a sense of increased isolation and loneliness that has very real health effects, both physical and mental health effects for older adults. So our approach in AARP is that we really seek to support communities to make better choices in housing, transportation, and public spaces in pursuit of places that are good places for people of all ages. So that means things like supporting House Bill 2001. AARP Oregon was very actively involved in the support for many years. As well as advocacy for accessory dwelling units and universal design in housing and much more. So I want to kind of lay out a little bit of the programs and the research that we have that I hope will inform your recommendations to the city. So you heard mention of our network of age-friendly states and communities. More than about 500 communities across the country are part of this network, including 8 in Oregon, including Springfield. Eugene is not yet a member. But these are communities that have recognized that demographic shift coming their way and are preparing actively for that future. They're looking at each of these domains that you see here in small print: housing, outdoor spaces, transportation, but also looking at things like communication and information. How are older adults getting their information? How are they reflected in employment and in volunteer opportunities? And these age-friendly communities are making the needs of older adults a driving force for some of their decisions in each of these domains, knowing again that when you're planning a community for older adults, you're really ultimately creating a place that works for people of all ages. Our conclusion or our belief is that, sorry, these are coming in a strange way. We do that because we recognize that, again, our housing is not really designed for an aging population. Most housing across the US is built for able-bodied families, often 2 parents, often 2 children, again, able-bodied, but that's not who we are these days. In 2020, the dominant American household type is single adults living alone. And as I mentioned, more than 85% of our housing stock is 2 or more bedrooms. So we put together publications like the one you see here called Making Room, which advocates and describes how communities around the country are using different housing solutions to bridge that gap and to make themselves better prepared for that demographic future. Missing middle housing is a huge part of that in our perspective. Part of that is really driven by wanting to understand what people want as they age. So we know that there's a very strong desire of people 50 plus to remain in their home and community. Eugene's a great place to live. People want to remain there as they age. And but what we also see is that fewer than half believe they will be able to stay in their homes. And that's for any number of reasons. It could be for affordability, it could be for accessibility, it could be that they want a lifestyle change. It could be for any number of reasons, but the reality is that There are housing choices that are going to be made. There are housing decisions that are going to be made. Some of those require modifications to an existing home. Whereas about 60% of adults own their home, still about a third report that major modifications are needed in order to allow them to age in place. There's an increasing appetite, certainly pre-COVID, I think that still is sustained even now during and post-COVID, that people are more willing to share their home, both for the sense of loneliness and isolation that they want to stave off, but also for economic reasons and for help and caregiving reasons. In our perspective, ADUs play a huge role in the solution here. They're not the only solution, but they're a big part of it. And in the survey that we did in 2018 from where these numbers come, about 7% of our respondents reported that they already have an ADU in one form or fashion, but about a third would be interested in building one. And we wanted to understand what was behind that interest and that need, because I think there's a perception that, ADUs are just built for the Airbnb, business model. The reality is that a lot of people, the majority of people said that they want to have a place for a loved one to stay who needs care, or to provide a home for family members or friends, or to have someone living close by to feel more secure, or a place for guests to stay, or for extra income. So these are all very practical reasons that make a real difference in people's lives, particularly when you're looking at caregiving. And I think, these numbers might be even different now, now that people are looking for ways to stay out of congregate living facilities. If there's a home adjacent to one's home, or a possibility for a caregiver to live close by, this housing model is very appealing. And it makes a lot of sense from our perspective in terms of the housing needs and the demographics that we see. And yet there are a lot of people that are not able to build one or see barriers to doing that. Beyond the people who say they don't need one and never will, which is fine. The other major barriers end up being, and these are the darker green bars here, the cost of modifying one's home. So, again, this is not an inexpensive proposition, but certainly the most problematic issue is the fact that they're not allowed, or that people don't want to deal with being a landlord or are concerned about property taxes. So there are very real things that, stand in the way here, but I think the question is, how can we lower the barriers? How can we eliminate the obstacles for those that really do want to have this housing solution available to them, to allow them to remain in their community? So we really believe that ADUs can help fit an aging population. We know that there are clear benefits for older adults, and that also they can provide below market housing solutions for people of all ages. We think it's a great way to gently add housing stock without changing the dynamics of existing communities. And we've really stood on the front line in a number of communities to advocate for these directly, in places like Burlington, Vermont, and Des Moines, Iowa, Lexington, Kentucky, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and there in the state of Oregon. ARP has put our name and our brand and our volunteers and our staff out front to say that these housing options really are an important part of creating a more age-friendly and a more livable community. In fact, we're working on updating a model zoning code, a model ADU code for the state and local level that will be released next year. That's an update to our 2000 code. And you read that right. It actually is from the year 2000. So we've been at this for a while. But the code is really in need of a refresh, and that will be coming out in the next few months. There's a lot more information, including this publication, which we think of as sort of a great orientation to the issue at aarp.org/ADU. We also mentioned, and I mentioned briefly, home modifications, how important that is to making homes a place where people can age well. I want to drive your attention to a new resource that we have called the Home Fit Guide, which has more than 100 room-by-room tips that allow homeowners, renters, people who live in apartments, people who live in houses, people who live in manufactured homes, to make modifications to their home so that it can be a better place for everyone. We're really trying to get people to think not just about their current needs, but about their future needs as well, and make a home that's visitable, that's accessible for people of all abilities, including for people who might come by to visit. We've purposely made it more inclusive with a deeper consideration of cultural traditions, and we're translating it into a number of languages. And we've included more information on the role of smart home tech in terms of how that can be helpful to helping people, again, stay in their home longer. So this guide is available for free as well, both in download and in print. And then just a quick note, these housing solutions that we talk about, they are not just urban solutions. These really do work in all contexts. And, a good part of Oregon is rural, and not that far outside of Eugene, we know, is rural. So these housing solutions do make sense everywhere. We very much lean in on the missing middle housing frame in the rural livability context. Makes a lot of sense. Again, I encourage you to check out that guide, download the report. I know I'm coming up on time, so I want to quickly blast through a few resources we have just so that you're aware of them. You can find out about all of these at aarp.org/livable. We issue grants each year. We've issued about $6 million in 4 years now in small, quick action grants across the country in housing, in transportation, and in public spaces. So if you'd like to learn more, you can check out our website. We have a number of tools available. I really encourage you to sign up for our weekly newsletter by texting Livable to 50757. This is a weekly practitioner-oriented newsletter that comes out every week and includes new information from around the country. We also have the Livability Index and our searchable map, all of which are tools available to help local leaders like yourselves. I mentioned a number of our publications, but again, the website to access all of them is aarp.org/livable. I apologize, there should be, that's backwards. aarp.org/livable is the site. And finally, all these websites are here for your reference, but really we are here to support you, and we hope that you all are able to help support your local leaders to make the kind of policy change that we think are needed in order to really prepare Eugene for a better future for people of all ages.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I appreciate you being here. Okay, so next we have Ethan Stuckmeyer, who visited us previously, who is the Senior Planner of Housing Programs for the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. And Ethan, I won't reread your bio since we got it before, but I'm curious, did you have a presentation for us today, or are you just here to kind of take questions?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So I do have a presentation, and I'm wondering, it sounds like there was some specific interest of the panelists to hear from DLCD, maybe a different perspective. And so I wanted to maybe, and if it's okay with you, Alex, maybe pose the question back to the panelists about, do you want to see the slides, or do you want to just, I'm here to answer questions if you have them. The slides I have are about two kind of specific things. It's really quick refresher on the requirements of House Bill 2001, and then touching on reasonable siting and design standards, and then how the department and the rules are defining in areas for higher level middle housing. So it sounds like there's one in the chat about hear the presentation, but I'm open to either one.
Yeah, I think since the request from the panel was to hear a little bit more about the technical details, I think you should go for it.
All right, here we go. Thanks, Alex. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the slide. So this is just going to be a really quick overview of kind of the little bit more detail than we heard at the last presentation. And we'll talk about, again, just a little bit of a refresher on the requirements of House Bill 2001 for large cities, which is where the city of Eugene falls in. So again, the requirements for city of Eugene is that they allow duplexes on every lot and parcel that's zoned residentially and allow for the development of single family detached dwellings, and that they allow for the allowance of triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, and cottage cluster, those are housing types, in areas zoned residentially, and that allow for the development of single family detached dwellings. So two kind of different requirements related to the housing type on the where of middle housing. Additionally, cities have the ability to regulate siting and design standards of middle housing such that those standards do not cause unreasonable cost and delay, another term, an undefined term in the legislature that we'll talk about in a little bit, to the development of middle housing. And so what is siting and design? What does that mean? So siting standards are standards that are related to how big a structure is, where that structure sits on the site, how much backyard that structure needs to have, the position, bulk, scale, and form of the structure. And the design is related to the look, the feel of the features of that structure on that site. So that's the differentiation there. So now we're going to dive in to what unreasonable cost and delay means, how we define reasonable standards in the rulemaking process. So siting and design standards, like I just mentioned, the minimum lot size requirements, maximum density, setbacks, and then there's design standards like facade improvement, front door orientation, how many windows you might need to have on the front facade, those kind of things. And so you might remember from the last presentation that I gave this differentiation between the model code, which is a very specific set of code or standards that our department is establishing for cities to use as guidance or to adopt if they so choose. We've also heard from large cities that not many of those cities are going to be using that model code route, and instead they're going to be going with this minimum compliance standards. These are, like you might remember, this range of options that the department is providing cities, kind of the floor and the ceiling, the minimums, the maximums of standards. So all of the standards within both of those documents, those set of standards, are vetted to be quote unquote reasonable. And the reasonableness, as we're defining those in rules, is really measured by comparing a particular standard that's applied to middle housing and comparing that to the gap or the difference between applying that standard to middle housing and applying that same standard to a single family detached home or other housing types. So that's what we're measuring. And so when we say a standard is reasonable, we're saying that the gap there is not relatively wide or different. So the difference between those two standards is not vast. Okay, so here's some examples. I've got a couple examples, and we can go through some of these. And really, I pulled the ones out that are kind of the most controversial, so that we can kind of talk about those. And if you have questions, feel free to ask. So. Off-street parking. Whenever you're talking about development of housing or any other development, off-street parking quickly and always becomes kind of the sticking point. And so as we were going through drafting these rules, we tried to think about what is the amount of parking that a city can require of a developer that kind of trips that unreasonable threshold. And so we surveyed all of the cities in the state of Oregon that are subject to House Bill 2001 and found that no city requires more than 2 off-street parking spaces for a single family detached home. And so we're using that kind of as this barometer to think about, well, if you kind of scale up the number of units on that same size lot, how many off-street parking spaces could a city require? And I hesitate, in the italicized text here is actually pulled directly from the rule document. This is what you're looking at here is what's called Oregon Administrative Rule. And this really focuses on the city being able to require generally not more than 1 off-street parking space per unit for these middle housing types. So in a quadplex on a certain size lot, you can imagine that a city can only require 4 off-street parking spaces for that 4-plex. So really kind of trending towards 1 off-street parking space per unit. And then we defined the rules to kind of be responsive to the size of the site that a person is trying to build middle housing on. So if the site of the lot is really, really small, then the city maybe shouldn't be able to require that 4 parking spaces, and they should only be required to, or only be allowed to require a smaller number of parking to make the development pencil. You might have heard that kind of feasibility of that development penciling out in terms of return on investment and actually being able to make money back when you're building that development. So off-street parking has all sorts of impacts on not only the cost of the development, but the cost of the end user, the end person who's living in that unit. And so this is really kind of one of those sticking points when we think about unreasonable cost and delay. Okay, moving into minimum lot size. So really the intent of middle housing, and John mentioned this early in his presentation, is that it is single family detached scale. And it should, in theory, it doesn't really matter about the configuration internally to that unit. And the structure itself can either be a single family detached home, a triplex, a duplex, a quadplex, or something else. But the overall size of the development should be able to fit on the same lot that a single family detached home should be allowed to fit on. So when we're kind of thinking about the standards that should apply to what is the smallest possible piece of land that you could build middle housing on, we did a lot of analysis across the state and found that in large cities, in large and metro cities, almost 90% of the lots and parcels in those cities are 5,000 square feet or greater. And so this really became an important number as we were going through the minimum requirements for triplexes and quadplexes. So again, the italicized text here is pulled directly from the rules. So I apologize if it's a little jargony and hard to read, but basically the functional minimum lot size for a triplex in the rules is 5,000 square feet. So if a city like Eugene applies a minimum lot size requirement for a single family detached home that is 3,000 square feet, and you could build a single family detached home on a 3,000 square foot piece of land, the city has the ability to say, we can also allow triplexes on that same 3,000 square foot piece of land. Or we could just say, that seems a little bit small, and maybe a triplex isn't really a good fit for that small of a piece of land. So we're going to set that minimum lot size at 5,000 square feet, but we can't go higher than that. Alternatively, if a city has these really large lot standards, and that's very typical in cities that have like a 10,000 square foot lot size minimum, the city can still apply those same that same minimum lot size for a single family detached home and for a triplex. They just can't require a larger minimum lot size for a triplex in that instance. I know that was a little jargony. I apologize if that was confusing. But really quickly, other siting and design standards, and this is really getting back to some points about we really are trying to be intentional about the fact that middle housing should look and feel, should create this kind of similar environment to single family detached homes in existing neighborhoods. So throughout setbacks, building height, minimum lot coverage, or lot coverage standards, you're going to see a lot of the kind of same language, really deferring back to the standards that apply to single family detached homes and applying those same standards to middle housing. So one of our favorite phrases that we have used in the rule process is way down at the bottom. It's kind of that last sentence. So it may not establish a standard that is different that applies to detached single family dwellings in the same zone. So that's really intentional in trying to keep that kind of development pattern as similar as we can and not creating this like drastic change across neighborhoods. Okay, so in areas, the other sticking point in the rules about cities have to allow duplexes on every lot and parcels, and then the higher level middle housing types in areas. And so what does in areas even mean? Is that it's somewhere between every single lot and parcel minus one, and then no lots but one lot. So that's kind of the range that we were looking at. And what is a reasonable amount of allowance for these higher level middle housing types? And so generally in the minimum compliance standards, we're kind of thinking about where middle housing really isn't a good fit. Things like goal protected lands like floodplains or landslide areas, or in natural hazard areas, in tsunami areas, all of those kind of things. Those are goal protected lands, historic districts. And so that's one. The second is infrastructure constrained lands. So places that don't have infrastructure. And Alex, am I getting close to time? Okay.
Yeah, you're at 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna be really, really quick then. Okay. So then, so those are kind of like taken off of the top, and then we're thinking about the other collection of standards that would kind of dictate the where of middle housing. So you can think of like that minimum lot size standard saying, if there's just lots that are too small, then middle housing shouldn't be allowed on those sites. So you're kind of whittling away and getting smaller and smaller amounts of the where of middle housing through those existing standards. But I'm going to stop there. There's a little bit more that I could talk about, but I want to go to questions.
Thank you, Ethan. All right, so now we have until about 11 for questions. So please begin raising your hand with the participant function as always. And feel free to direct your questions to any of our speakers for today. Robert, go ahead.
My question goes to definition of terms. What exactly is defined as middle housing? I mean, from a price point, economic standpoint, social standpoint, whatever standpoint that may be, is there an official definition, and your thoughts about it?
Was that question for someone in particular?
Let's direct it first to Ethan. It's to the presenters in general, but I direct this to Ethan in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. So that's a good question. And I think there's two different answers. So there's the definition that John provided in his presentation, which is from Daniel Perelik and Opticos Design, who are kind of the coiners of the term middle housing. That really speaks to housing that looks and feels very similar to single family detached homes. It provides a walkable neighborhood, and the design, or it's affordable based on its kind of design features. And then there's the Oregon definition of middle housing, which defines the housing types of middle housing. It's not so much like a category, it's more of a housing type definition. So for the purposes of the state of Oregon, the legislature has defined middle housing as the housing types. So duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, and cottage cluster. Those housing types together is the definition of middle housing.
So I take it there's no definition of a price range for rentals and purchase cost.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Do any other presenters want to weigh in on that? Okay, let's go to Rosita.
Hi, this is a question for Danielle. I'm in my 50s, so I'm also an ART member, but I just wanted to ask, I'm interested in statistics of, like I'm quite happy in my single dwelling family home that I'm in now, but in time I might need, for medical reasons or whatever physical reasons, to go into some kind of care. And I'd really like to be able to stay in my own home, which was one of the things brought up. But I'm interested in the statistics of older people remaining in their single family unit, as opposed to, for example, my in-laws are in a gated community where there's manufactured homes and it's quite a big place. And then also there's aged care facilities. So I'm just wondering, between the three, are people mostly being catered for in aged care facilities? You know, if you can explain that a little bit more to me, if you can.
Sure. I mean, you know, our philosophy is that there is a space in the housing market for all of those things. So what we advocate for is greater choice for older adults, so that they do know that there is an option. It's not just you leave your single family home and you move into an aged care facility that provides a lot of services, that there are intermediate solutions. And that can mean that perhaps you have a caregiver, you know, live in the ADU back, or maybe you get a roommate in your home. There are a lot of services now, things like Silver Nest, that are specifically designed to help older adults find and screen roommates that can provide some level of support and help in exchange for lower rents, which again allows people to stay in their homes longer. So I don't have great statistics on who chooses what different housing option. I will say the price points are very different, right? Like the economic impacts are you know, facilities that provide a lot of care are incredibly expensive. And for people who, you know, don't have unlimited retirement savings, delaying the point at which people need to enter those higher cost facilities can be a very important part of ensuring their financial health overall. So again, our MO is all about trying to provide options, trying to allow for people to live where they want to live, knowing that some people will choose the age restricted, you know, retirement community. Some people will choose or need the aged care community, but there are a whole bunch of people who are more than happy to stay in their home if they can sort of fill the gaps of what they need in terms of mobility and care with other resources around them.
Thank you.
Sure.
Let's move to Abigail.
Hi. So my question's for Ethan. So the last slide you showed, there were like two ways of managing, I'm not totally sure, but the second one seemed like it was like way more flexible. So are we trying to decide how that shakes down? Or because it seemed like the second, can you talk about that last slide again?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. I apologize. I ran out of time there.
No, it seemed important, but it was kind of like, it took me a sec to digest it. And I kind of would like to hear it again, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's related to the two different ways that a city can define in areas, right? And so the first way is they just go along with the minimum compliance standards that say middle housing is allowed on all of these lots except for where it shouldn't be allowed, things like goal protected land, so on and so forth. And using those minimum compliance standards to fit in middle housing within the existing standards. There's also this alternative path, which is called the performance metric approach. This is an option that's available to cities to say, we don't really like the minimum lot size requirement of the minimum compliance standards. We feel like middle housing doesn't really fit on those lots. And so they kind of have this off ramp to say, we're going to apply a different minimum lot size to middle housing, and that'll determine the where. However, if the city goes that route, then they need to meet these performance metric standards, which would say that they need to be allowing triplexes on 80% of the eligible lots and parcels, which are lots and parcels that are zoned residentially and allow for the development of single family detached home. 80% of those lots should allow at least a triplex, 70% should allow a cottage cluster and a quadplex, and then 60% of those lots should allow a townhome. And so that gives cities additional flexibility on top of the minimum compliance standards to say, where middle housing and on what lots that should be allowed on. So that's the short version of that.
So is that presented to the city as, because I mean, who wouldn't, I guess I don't understand, like, oh, less flexibility sounds lame. This seems like it would make things more flexible, but am I missing something on that? Who wouldn't choose that?
Yeah, there's some, I don't want to say strings attached, but there's some additional requirements to that flexibility, ensuring that the distribution of middle housing is equitable in terms of allowing at least or spreading out the allowance of middle housing in all neighborhoods, as opposed to maintaining. Really, the purpose of that section is to try to not allow the cities to keep intact these kind of exclusive neighborhoods, the really expensive neighborhoods, the neighborhoods who typically don't allow middle housing within their boundaries. So that's really the intent. And if a city goes that route, then they are still on the hook for kind of distributing middle housing allowances equally across those neighborhoods.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. Thank you.
Good question.
All right, we've got Chaya up next.
This is actually for Ethan. I was wondering if, I understand we have regular setbacks and front doors, but are we able to require them to build green, if it's energy stable to mind? Like, hey, if you build a new lot, you have to have the environment in mind. Or are we able to give society, if they decide to use solar power, they can get a society from the government to help them build that? Is that something that we could do and we could suggest, or is that unfeasible?
No, I think that's a determination that the city is able to make. So DLCD is not going to make that decision for the city to determine, what sort of sustainable standards they are interested in applying to middle housing or any other development for that matter. But if the only thing I would say there is the city cannot require only middle housing to have those kind of standards, because we're very, very close or guarded for unreasonable cost and delay. Things like solar panels, while great, are expensive, right? And do cause potentially unreasonable cost and delay. So if those standards are applied to single family detached homes and middle housing, that's great. But if they're only applied to middle housing, that's where it gets a little bit more difficult in terms of unreasonable cost and delay.
Okay, thank you.
Aaron, you're up.
Hi, yeah, I have a question for John and Danielle. I would like to hear some I guess maybe not a question, but I would like to hear examples of effective tactics that have been used when working with cities or developers on challenges to creating middle housing.
I guess I could go first. I rattled some off at the very end. Did those not make sense, or do you want a particular one to be expanded?
I think, do you have any like very specific like instances or anecdotes?
Well, system development charges. I don't know whether you guys have been exposed to what those are. The city, when you build a house, will charge you up to $14,000 upfront just to get a permit. And that $14,000 goes to being able to repair or expand streets as necessary, to be able to ensure there's capacity in the sewer system for your project, extending electricity, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's additional costs if you specifically need those extended to you as well. The system development charges for building an accessory dwelling unit, which can, as if I remember correctly, can only be 800 square feet, is essentially the same as the cost of building a 2,500, 3,000 square foot house. That doesn't make sense, and is frankly a disincentive for someone to build an ADU. So hopefully you will consider encouraging the city to look at either eliminating or reducing SDC charges for this type of housing. So that's one. Another one that's a little more creative is something called community land trust. And in that case, you would have a nonprofit who would actually purchase the land for housing to be built. And then they would then either build housing or make those lots available to individuals to build housing on that property. The community land trust would hold that property, the land itself, in their ownership. You would have ownership of the house. And typically what happens there is, if you do build a house or buy a house in that situation, you also sign an agreement that says when you sell your property, you won't charge more than a reasonable amount to the next person, so that that house stays affordable as you move along. There's an excise tax that the city can put on construction up to, I think, 2%. That money now is going into a fund to pay for affordable housing, those projects that are built by Cornerstone or St. Vincent de Paul or Homes for Good, or that are Homes for Good, for affordable housing, which are subsidized and people can rent at a lower price, but that money is not available for people to be able to buy housing. So those are just a few examples of what could be considered, but that won't happen with just adopting code, which is my point.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Does that help, Aaron?
Yes.
And Aaron, your question made me think about some of the strategies to sort of convince people of the merits of it. Is that part of what you're thinking about too?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've experienced this, in basically all the states where we work. We have an ARP state office in every state, and what comes to mind is Minneapolis, where they just passed 2 years ago the MSP 2040 plan, which prior to state of Oregon was nominally the first sort of municipal effort to eliminate single family zoning. And part of the reason we got involved in the ARP is because a lot of the folks who stood up against that plan were, frankly, older, white, wealthier area residents, and yet from ARP's perspective, it seemed to be working against the interest of what we knew to be the interests and the needs of older adults as a whole. So we brought in Dan Perolick himself, did some talks to communities, but one of the things I wanted to mention is one of the things he did was a neighborhood walk. So we literally did a walking tour of communities, and he pointed out examples of where missing middle housing already existed in communities, and they're there. I mean, they can be found. So it's a matter of pointing them out to people, because I think sometimes the fact that they're so well designed works against them, right? It's not apparent, not obvious that there's an ADU in the back, or there's that's actually a duplex because it's so well designed. So I think walking tours can be really helpful. And then I think just, sort of testimonials, people, why they benefit, why they want to build a second unit, who that's for, how that helps their family, how that helps their sort of financial situation, how that lets them stay in the community longer so they can contribute to the community that they've lived in for decades. Those kinds of personal stories, I think, and unpacking the why can go a long way.
Cool.
Can I add one more thing, Aaron?
Mm-hmm.
I participated in what another part of this process called the Local Partners Roundtable, and that was me from the Neighborhood Association, AARP, the Chamber of Commerce, developers, Thousand Friends of Oregon, League of Women Voters, et cetera. And when we gave our feedback to the city, almost to a person, we said, please look at affordability. Don't just pass code that makes everything too expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Let's move on to Shauna.
Hey, so I had a question specifically for Danielle. So I wanted to, I know that you're with AARP, but I wanted to ask more questions about disabled people, since you were one of the only presenters so far to bring up, those kinds of voices. So I wanted to, are there any specific resources for disabled people, specifically when it comes to their rights to middle housing or affordable housing? I guess my question is, what kind of considerations are there for disabled people when it comes to middle housing?
I think that they mostly kick in when there are public dollars invested. So I think that actually might be a little bit of, and I don't quote me on this, but my hunch and knowing what I know of, when federal dollars go into a multifamily housing project, there are requirements for the degree to which some of those units are made accessible. If missing these fourplexes, triplexes, duplexes are probably not going to get any federal dollars. And so in some ways they are outside of that federal requirement, which is kind of a disservice and kind of an unfortunate outcome. Arguably, I mean, I think Ethan's made the very good point that we don't want to hold missing middle housing to a standard that's higher than we place on single family housing development. Nevertheless, I think missing middle housing and particularly, things like ADUs can very much be designed with accessibility in mind. So in my mind, it's a perfect and sweet spot for the city to come in and say, we'll fast track permitting for units that offer accessibility. We'll provide additional incentives. We'll lower that service development charge even further. Whatever the sort of carrot that they can bake into this process in order to generate and create more accessible homes.
Yeah, thank you. I think yeah, that answers my question. It seems though that a lot of the when it comes to housing for disabled people, it seems to be assumed that either they have access to a house or already have a house. And that, either as they become more disabled or as they need a caregiver, they can add on an ADU. And I just wanted to, it seems like there's really a section of housing missing for maybe lower income disabled people.
I think that's a fair point. And I think that kind of goes back to what some of our intention is around the home fit guide, is that we really want to begin to change housing stock as a whole, not just for people who are disabled and not just for people who are trying to build an accessible unit, but just to think about how can you make very small modifications if you are constructing new or if you're renovating that actually make it more visitable, that make it more accessible for anyone wherever, whenever they may move into that unit or visit that unit.
Right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, and I want to acknowledge that we're almost, or now we are at our official stop time for this, but I see that there are several more hands up. Would anybody object if we went to 11:05 for this section and tried to get through as many questions as possible? Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up, not hearing any objections. All right, so let's, if we can do kind of one response per question, and let's try to get through these last 3 minutes if possible. So let's go to Francisco next.
Hi, just a quick question for any of the experts. Let's assume I'm a developer and it's the year 2022, and I want to build housing based on the HB 2001, and I have my attorneys and I got money, and I want to get the ball rolling. Like, how many years can you guys estimate it will take me to actually start renting these places to the middle class?
Yeah, I can try to answer that one. So the local permitting process is a long one. So House Bill 2001 requires cities to be ready to go with their development standards by June 30th of 2022. So at that point in time, applications can begin to come into the cities. That review process, the approval process, the back and forth between the city and the developer is a long time. And I don't know the average development time for, or the approval time, entitlement time for developments in the city of Eugene, but I would imagine that it's months and months and months. And so then you begin the construction, and then, you know, all of this thing, you've got to build it, and then you've got to rent people or take applications or sell it or whatever. So it can take a long time. I don't know. I mean, it's probably in the range of, I don't know, 6 to 12 months, but.
Thank
I
you.
guess I can add one thing, and that is that there's something called the 120-day rule, which says once a developer submits an application, the city has to either approve or deny it within 120 days. But that's only after the developer has done all of his due diligence, prepared his plan, and got it ready to go to the city. And then, as Ethan says, once you get the permit, you still have to get financing and do your construction. So it's I think 6 to 9 months is very optimistic, Ethan. It's probably more like years.
Great, let's go to Ayana.
Hey, so my question was for John, and I believe someone else kind of covered the first part of my question, which was kind of about we went really quickly through the factors that go into making middle housing affordable. So I appreciated going back over that, but I also wondered, you said that there was very little opportunity for compromise in the decision-making processes. And I kind of wondered if you had any advice about how to get involved in really making sure that the important things are implemented when going over these things and in the whole process of getting everything approved. How can we make sure that the important things about making middle housing affordable actually do get implemented and listened to? Is it just kind of being involved in the appeal process as much as possible if needed, or?
Well, thank you. Let me try to answer that somewhat succinctly. The appeals process basically is the real opportunity for developers and neighbors to try to get their way, as it were, as a project moves forward. And frankly, in my opinion, that's way too late. There is a requirement in the city of Eugene that there be a developer neighbor meeting that occurs right before the application is submitted to the city. But typically the way that's working now is that a developer goes through all his due diligence, he makes his plans, he's put a whole lot of money into what he wants to do. And then before he can check that box, he has a meeting with the neighbors where basically they tell him what their problems were. Typically his answer is, well, I'm sorry, I've already designed this, I can't change it. So we're kind of pushing through our neighborhood planning process that we're engaged in, that meeting could occur earlier, so that indeed the developer can hear the concerns of the neighborhood. So appeals are expensive, there's no doubt about it. And neighbors sometimes get involved in appeals with the express purpose of slowing the thing down so it's not feasible for the developer to build. And that's not right. It's not right for the neighbors, and it's not right that the neighbors feel that's the only option they have. So hopefully if we can find a way that there's more involvement earlier on and there's an opportunity for give and take, that's not a problem. The other piece of this is that the state is indeed sort of imposing a set of rules on the cities to make it clear and objective on how this process will move forward. And hopefully there'll be less opportunities for appeal in the future as projects move forward. I don't know that I answered your question, but ask me more if I didn't.
No, that was great, actually. I think that I got a good idea of that. I do wonder, though, is that something that in our process here we get to put our 2 cents in about, or is that something kind of separate?
If it's an issue for you, I would encourage you talking to planning staff about it, and they can give you feedback on how they think that indeed there could be more opportunity for smoothing that path forward. I think it's a great idea. They have good ideas. I can help.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I just think that your presentation was really realistic and to the point, and I was really interested to hear, you know, the things that people don't normally think about and things like these. So I appreciated that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Alrighty, so we are at 11:06, and I really want to make sure that everybody gets a break and gets ample time to work in their task committees today. So I see that we still have two hands with from Cheryl and Judy, and I'd like to just ask the two of you to hold your questions, and hopefully you can ask them on Tuesday. So sorry about that. There's never enough time. There's so many wonderful questions. But let me hand it back over to Lynn to announce what time we'll be coming back from break. And thank you again to our presenters for today. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Alex. So let's come back. I'm going to fudge here just a little bit, if you don't mind. Let's come back at 11:20. No, you know what? I'm not. 11:22. 11:22. We all need just a breather, a break. It should never fudge on breaks unless absolutely necessary, and it's not. So 11:20.